good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, whenever you're watching this. This video lecture is on Plotinus, and we'll review a little bit what we went through last week in class, and then I'll give an interpretation of Plotinus, hopefully to help you understand him more concretely. Okay? And by the way, most of the slides are very full with notes, so you'll only see me on video for the first couple of slides. Okay, so here we go. This is a diagram. This is the one I actually put on the board. Uh, Plotinus's philosophy is one of emanation. And so he posits an absolute reality, which is the one. Its characteristics are unity. It's the first principle because um, nothing has brought the one into being. It is the first principle, the highest reality, from which everything else emanates. Okay, so that's why Plotinus claims that the one is self-caused, and it is also the cause of everything else in the universe of the cosmos. Okay, the first emanation from the one is mind. Now, because the one is so simple and so unified, there really is no awareness or cognition. It's the first emanation of mind or nous, which brings in the idea of some sort of awareness or consciousness. Okay? So the mind, it's the domain of the Platonic forms. He considers himself a Platonist, and again, I'll explain the forms a little later. But it's the domain of all the forms, and what the mind does, because there is now awareness involved, it contemplates the one, and it also contemplates itself. This doesn't really make much sense right now, but I'll explain that a little bit later. Okay. Then the second emanation is soul. Now, in Plotinus's philosophical system, there's something called the world soul, and then the soul of the natural world and the human soul. We're just going to focus on the human soul, okay, because this is relevant to the various forms of mysticism we'll be covering, right? The soul, one thing about Plotinus, he defines the soul as a principle of wanting or desiring something external to you. And what that means in maybe modern language is that, for instance, if I want a cup of coffee and I look and here's my coffee mug, there you go. If I want to drink coffee, notice that the object, the cup and the coffee is outside of myself. So I am conscious of the cup, right? So there's a sense where uh, we are taken out of our consciousness as we focus on external objects, right? And so it is the principle of what he calls desire. And again, we'll get into that more concretely a little bit later. And then the final emanation is matter. Now, he defines matter as evil, but as we said in class last week, evil isn't some active entity like like Satan coming after you, for instance. The definition of evil is really what he calls privation, um, that it is the lack of unity, the lack of awareness, the lack of any kind of activity. It's the furthest away from the one. And so if we use, again, source of light, so if you're in a completely dark room, you turn on this light bulb, the light itself is the one. The brightness through which you can see things is the nous, and the soul is that principle of going out, and then matter would be at the very end of the illumination, where things are kind of twilighty and dark and ambiguous. And so if we use the metaphor of light, we can begin understanding what this so-called matter is. So that area at the end where things are, like a twilight, there's very little light, um, uh, that's matter, and matter is called quote unquote evil in the sense that it lacks the light. Okay, it lacks clarity, it lacks illumination. All right. Here are a couple more ways that we can understand this process of emanation. So the reason I'm giving you these different ways is because and this also includes the previous slide, any way we try to systematize or represent Plotinus's philosophy really misses the point. Okay, so at the top diagram, we could say the one is that overall principle of unity, and what is a smaller, quote unquote, or lesser than the one is the mind. The soul, as it emanates out, it's lesser than the mind. Yeah. And then as the emanation further goes out, matter is even less than the soul. Okay. So there's sort of a reduction in size, metaphorically speaking, in the first uh, diagram. The second diagram, we put the soul at the smallest circle. That is, it is the source from which emanates the mind. And then it goes out, and we see the soul and then matter. Okay. And so a few things we have to keep in mind. First of all, this whole notion of emanation, it's not something that occurs in time. It's not as if at some point in time there was the one, the uncaused cause. Okay. And then 1 second, 1 hour later, the mind emanates, and then a little bit of time goes by, and then there's a soul, and then the matter. That's not Plotinus's concept of how this emanation works. Emanation is not a process in time. Okay. It is simply, um, not simply, it is something that is beyond space and time. And emanation is simply presented as a theory because, in the end, Plotinus's philosophy is about the soul returning back to the one. Right? If we used in terms of mysticism, he is wanting his students to experience the one, not have this philosophical system, right? This complex metaphysics. Okay. All right. So um, these next set of slides is called Plotinus, a phenomenological interpretation. We're not going to get into what phenomenology is. It's basically the study of phenomenology. But really, it's something that we begin, a style of philosophy beginning with human experience. And I think this is a way of coming to understand Plotinus more concretely. And given that he is really trying to help his students reach the one, to return back to your source and have this mystical experience, understanding Plotinus through concrete human experience is probably a way of understanding him more clearly. Okay, so here's the next slide. Okay, so let's begin at the very end, matter, where it's twilight, it's ambiguous. Okay, now, from this perspective, okay, we can talk about perception, how we experience the world. And one way to understand our perception is that all perception is structured as foreground and background. Okay, so when you focus on an object, objects that are around you fade into the background. Okay, and it's very simple to understand. So if you're sitting at your desk and I have this water bottle here, when I intently focus on the water bottle, I can still perceive the other objects like this computer. I'm recording this lecture. I have a bookshelf near me, a piece of paper, my iPhone. All those objects become very blurred as I focus just on this water bottle. Okay. And so, like I said before, the background is still perceived. The third point is that perception is structured in this way, in this sense, that there is no perception of an object without a background. Okay. So when I look at this water bottle, it's not as if perception is simply like uh, seeing the object in and of itself, devoid of anything else. There's always a background, a horizon, if you will. Okay. So if we interpret matter differently from Plotinus in a more contemporary modern way. So we are so quote unquote an embodied soul, which means we have a mind and body and we're conscious, okay? And so we experience the world around us. It could be the natural world. It could be if you're sitting in the classroom, right? You're experiencing the classroom. But keeping in mind that perception has this foreground, the object that you're looking at, and background, the sort of more ambiguous background as they kind of fade into ambiguity as we focus on one object. Okay. So what we are explicitly experiencing has this ambiguous horizon or background, okay? And it's kind of like a blank screen. We'll just use the metaphor of playing a movie, okay? Before you can actually play a movie, before you can actually see, these concrete objects in the movie, you need a screen, right, as a background. And that's another way of understanding what matter is, okay? And then what the soul does, as the soul desires objects, it's almost like a projection on this a screen. So we're playing the movie now. Characters are talking to each other, they're moving, they're getting into trouble, perhaps. And again, this is just a metaphor of playing a movie. Okay, so the matter then is that background, very ambiguous, in this case, a blank background. Okay, now let's go to the soul. So we began with matter, now we're going to go to the soul. The first principle here is that our consciousness, when we perceive things, is intentional. Okay, so when you just simply reflect, every time you're conscious of something. And that's the definition of intentionality. All consciousness is a consciousness of X. That is, all consciousness is a perceiver who perceives an object. Okay. Now, when we look at Plotinus's concept of the soul, and as in your packet on page 11, there's a definition of soul in bold, actually, by Lloyd Gerson, who is a scholar on Plotinus. He says, the soul is the principle of desiring those objects that are external to the agent of desire. And that simply means that you, as a conscious being, there is a going out of yourself and looking into the world. I see the water bottle, I see a friend, and I want to talk to my friend. Okay, so we're going out of ourselves, so to speak, from consciousness, and we're seeing objects. So we could understand soul, not so much in this like a spirit or this sort of ethereal sense, but the soul then is our consciousness of the things around us, our experienced world. And as I said before, every time we perceive an object, the object is always set against an ambiguous background. So that's kind of like matter, okay? So here you are as a conscious being, your consciousness is a soul, you're perceiving an object outside, but as you perceive these objects, the other objects in the world recede into the background. Okay. Okay. Now let's go to the divine mind. It gets a little more abstract or heady here. Okay. When we are in the world and we're perceiving things, okay, we understand our world. Okay. This is a very actually simple concept. When you walk into the classroom, you understand it's a classroom. You see desks, chairs, your professor who's going to teach is maybe, looking over her notes, whatever. You understand what's going on. There's a sense of what they call intelligibility. All right. Now, the first thing of intelligibility is that when we see something, right, we think it's a whole entity. We look at, the professor, prepping a few minutes for a class. That professor is a human being as a whole. The people sitting around you are too. Maybe you bring in your water bottle. Your water bottle is seen as a whole object. Okay. In other words, any object you perceive has characteristics, right? Water bottle is round. Maybe it's the color is blue. Okay, and so there are these attributes which this thing called the water bottle has. Okay, you can describe it as maybe 6 inches tall, it has cylindrical shape, and has a color blue. Okay. Now, these attributes or characteristics of these objects is also true of the classroom. So when you walk into the classroom, you see chairs and desks and other students maybe sitting down. All these are attributes. That is, you understand the classroom as having these different aspects. Okay. Now let's get into this notion. Okay, so that's intelligibility. Okay, we understand the world through seeing things which has characteristics. Okay. Now, Plotinus says that the mind is the domain of the so-called Platonic forms. Now, I listed the fundamental forms, but uh, forms are multiple. Okay, it's more than just those five forms that I listed. Okay, so let's look at some basic idea of Plato, what he's trying to say, what his philosophy is about. So, Platonic forms are abstract, perfect forms that are instantiated in our natural world as imperfect physical copies of these forms. Okay, and when I was taking, the history of philosophy, when I studied Plato as an undergraduate, professors used a very common paradigm or metaphor. Okay, so an example here. The common example is the idea of a triangle. So any triangle that we experience in the world, so you can go up to the board and draw a triangle. Maybe you have uh, some object that's shaped as a triangle. All these triangles, whether you draw it, whether you paint it, even if you kind of think about it, or if you see it in the world, like three pieces of wood put together in a triangle, all these are imperfect, right? They are just physical, imperfect objects that has this shape. But there is a perfect triangle, okay? And the perfect triangle is abstract. It doesn't exist in the world, okay? But it is because, and this is Plato's idea, it is because there are these abstract forms like the form of a triangle that exist, above the world or beyond the world, that actual imperfect triangles is what we experience, right? So think of it maybe as a hierarchy. You have the world of the forms that are abstract beyond the material world, but in our material world, we see triangles as imperfect manifestations of the perfect triangle in the world of forms. Okay, and of course Plotinus, who claims he's a Platonist, uh, he places these forms in the divine mind. Okay, so for Plotinus, the mind is the domain of these Platonic forms. Soul is the principle of desire in embodied beings. Okay. Now we're talking about the soul. So emanating from the divine mind is the soul. And in this example that I'm using, something more concrete, it's your consciousness. You're perceiving the world as an embodied being. Okay. So the soul is the principle of desire in embodied beings, us humans. And we humans perceive the world as intelligible. We understand what the world is, whether it's specific objects or even if it's a domain like a classroom. Okay. Okay. Now the example he uses is beauty. Okay. So here we have the function of the mind in our experience and the soul. How do we in the end get to the one? Okay. And I'll explain this in more detail on Wednesday when we have our regular class. Okay. But basically, this is an example I used in the last class. You listen to a piece of music that's beautiful. You actually feel the beauty of this music. Okay. If you try to locate beauty in that specific song, let's say it's 2.5 minutes, for Plotinus, you're making a mistake. Because what is it about this song that's so beautiful that maybe arouses some emotion in you? Well, it can't be the actual sound strung together itself, right? Because if you take each note and look and listen to just these notes separate from the song, you're not going to perceive beauty. You're just going to hear a note, okay? So the notes, all the notes that are collected in this particular song, there's a unity to that, okay? And the understanding of beauty doesn't come from just the actual song that you're hearing. Beauty is a form in the divine mind that is, in a way, projected out. And that's how you really understand beauty. Okay, all beautiful things in the world, okay, they are beautiful according to Plotinus, but the beauty itself, the essence of what beauty is, isn't found in the external objects. Okay, It's the intelligibility we have, the fact that the soul is emanated from the mind and we're connected to the mind, that the Platonic forms are, let's just say, projected onto the screen of matter. And then we can experience, concretely songs, beautiful songs. Okay. And to end this, we're going to talk about the one is the experience of unity. Okay. And all I'm going to say in this video lecture is that whenever we experience anything, whether it's a particular object, your favorite song, or when you walk into the classroom and you kind of know that this is a classroom, right? Because it has all these objects and characteristics of what a classroom is. Okay. In the end, all these different aspects of our perception, okay, they're unified somehow. There is a sense of unity in our understanding. And that is that experience. We don't really think about it because we don't really reflect. When we live in the world, we got to get to class or we got to go eat lunch. We don't reflect on this. But if you contemplate your experience, right, for Plotinus, you will eventually come back to the one. Okay. And to understand how that happens, we would have to look at the so-called spiritual exercises that Plotinus talks about in his readings, right? And so that's what we will talk about. We'll actually look at one of Plotinus's essays in your packet, which will be listed in the schedule I'll be posting soon. Um, and through the process of contemplation, we'll begin to have a better sense of what it means to understand the one. Okay. All right, so that's it for the video lecture, and I'll see you on Wednesday.